It began with a silence, a terrifying, unnatural silence that severed the connection between the civilized world and the burning plains of northern India. On a blistering afternoon in May 1857, inside the telegraph office at Ambala, the needle of the receiver stopped clicking. The line to Delhi was dead. In the days before radio, before satellite communication, that silence was more ominous than the roar of cannon fire. It meant that the nerve center of the British administration in the north had simply ceased to exist. To understand the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe that was about to unfold, one must first understand the illusion of permanence that blanketed the British Raj in the mid-19th century. To the casual observer, or perhaps a newly arrived subaltern from a leafy shire in England, the empire in 1857 appeared as solid as the granite of St. Paul's Cathedral. Map of India was washed in imperial pink. The East India Company commanded a standing army larger than that of most European powers, and the administration was run by men who believed, with a near-religious fervor, in the divine right of their governance. Officers played cricket on manicured lawns in the cantonments, their wives organized amateur theatricals, and regimental bands played airs from Italian operas in the cool of the evening. It was a world of supreme, intoxicating confidence. But beneath this veneer of order, the foundation was rotting. The British presence in India was a grand deception, a house of cards held together by prestige and the loyalty of the Sipahi, the Indian soldier. For every British soldier stationed on the subcontinent, there were 7 Indian soldiers. 40,000 Europeans were scattered across a landmass the size of Europe, surrounded by 300,000 trained, armed, and increasingly disaffected Sipahis. The British were not holding India by force, they were holding it by the permission of those they ruled. And on that Sunday in May, permission was withdrawn. The spark was struck in Meerut, a massive garrison town just 40 miles northeast of Delhi. It was Sunday, the 10th of May. The church bells were ringing for evening service, calling the British officers and their families to prayer. They went unarmed, unconcerned, lulled by the lethargy of the hot season. They did not see the storm gathering in the bazaars and the barracks. The grievances were many, pay, caste disputes, distant wars, but they had coalesced into a single, terrifying rumor that the new Enfield rifle cartridges were greased with the fat of cows and pigs, an abomination designed to defile both Hindu and Muslim alike, breaking their caste and forcing their conversion to Christianity. It does not matter now whether the rumor was true or false. What matters is that it was believed. As the sun set over Meerut, the horizon turned the color of blood. The Sipahi regiments broke ranks. The cavalry, the pride of the company's army, mounted their horses not to parade, but to kill. The jails were thrown open, releasing a flood of criminals into the streets. What followed was a night of medieval horror. Bungalows were torched with families trapped inside. Officers who rushed to the parade grounds to calm their men they had led for decades, men they called their children, were cut down in a hail of musket balls. The illusion of the Raj evaporated in the smoke of burning thatch. But the true disaster was not the mutiny at Meerut, it was the incompetence that followed. The British garrison at Meerut contained over 2,000 European troops, plenty enough to crush the uprising in its cradle, but the commanders were old, doddery, and paralyzed by shock. They did nothing. They secured their own perimeter and watched the city burn. They allowed the mutineers to escape into the night. And the mutineers, realizing they were not being pursued, turned their horses toward the one place that could transform a local riot into a national war of independence: Delhi. Delhi was the psychological heart of India. Though the British held the administrative power in Calcutta, Delhi was the seat of the Mughal emperors. Inside the Red Fort, the aged king, Bahadur Shah Zafar, lived on a British pension, a relic of a bygone age. He was a poet, not a warrior, a frail old man with no real power, yet his name still commanded the reverence of millions. If the mutineers could reach him, if they could raise the green standard of Islam and the banner of the Mughals over the Red Fort, the mutiny would become a revolution. The mutineers rode all night, crossing the bridge of boats over the Yamuna River in the grey light of the morning of May 11th. They entered the city unopposed. The contagion spread like a virus. The Delhi garrison, composed almost entirely of Indian troops, turned on their British officers. The massacre that followed was absolute, Men, women, and children were hunted through the narrow, twisting lanes of the city. The bank was looted, the printing presses destroyed, the telegraph lines cut. There is a haunting story from that day of the young telegraph operator, a mere boy who stayed at his post as the mob battered down the doors. His final message, tapped out to the stations in the Punjab just moments before he was killed, read, "The Sipahs have come in from Meerut and are burning everything. We must shut up." That message was the only warning the world received. By nightfall, Delhi had fallen. The crescent moon flag flew over the red fort. The king had been proclaimed Emperor of Hindustan. The British had been wiped out, save for a few pitiful survivors hiding in the jungle. The loss of Delhi shattered the myth of British invincibility. It was a signal fire that could be seen from the Himalayas to the Deccan. The Ganges Valley, the fertile heartland of India, was suddenly gone, consumed by anarchy. But the eyes of the strategic planners did not look south to Calcutta, they looked north to the Punjab. The Punjab was the frontier, the wild, untamed borderland between India and Afghanistan. It had only been conquered by the British 8 years prior, after 2 brutal, bloody wars against the Sikh Empire. The Sikhs were the martial race of India, warriors by religion and tradition. They had fought the British to a standstill at battles like Chilianwala and Ferozshah. Now, the British administration in the Punjab sat atop a powder keg. If the Sikhs saw the British weakness, if they decided to join the mutiny to settle old scores, the game was up. The British would be crushed between the mutineers in the south and the Sikhs in the north. They would be driven into the sea, and the empire would be nothing more than a footnote in history. The situation was desperate. The commander-in-chief, General Anson, was in the hills, cut off from his army and rapidly succumbing to cholera. The civilian administration was trembling. The heat was rising, the thermometer pushing past 110 degrees in the shade. The loo, the hot, dust-laden wind of the Indian summer, flayed the skin and cracked the lips. It felt as though the land itself was rejecting the invaders. Every shadow seemed to hold an assassin, every servant was a potential executioner. Panic began to set in among the European families. They looked to their leaders for reassurance, but found only hesitation and red tape. The Victorian bureaucracy, designed for filing reports and collecting taxes, was utterly ill-equipped to deal with an apocalypse. They needed a savior, but they did not need a gentleman. The crisis was too raw, the violence too elemental for the polite rules of engagement taught at Sandhurst. They did not need a diplomat who would negotiate, nor a strategist who would draw lines on a map. They needed a force of nature. They needed a man who understood the language of violence better than the mutineers themselves. They needed a man who could stare into the eyes of a tiger and make the beast blink. In the dusty, dangerous station of Peshawar, at the very edge of the map, there was such a man. He was a giant, standing over 6 feet 2 inches, with a flowing dark beard and eyes that were described by those who met him as colorless, like the eyes of a lion. He walked with a heavy, imperious tread, and when he spoke, he did not argue, he pronounced. He was 34 years old, yet he carried the weight of a biblical prophet. He was a brigadier-general, but to the tribesmen of the frontier, he was something more. He was a deity. His name was John Nicholson. And as the telegrams of disaster flooded in from Delhi, as the generals in the south wrung their hands and spoke of retreat, Nicholson stood on the veranda of his bungalow in Peshawar, looking out toward the Khyber Pass. He did not feel fear. He did not feel panic. He felt a cold, terrifying clarity. He knew, with the instinct of a predator, that the time for laws and regulations had passed. The time for the sword had arrived. The empire was crumbling, and he would have to hold it together with his bare hands, through sheer force of will and a brutality that would shock even the hardest soldiers of his generation. The hook was set. The tragedy had begun, but the response was riding a black stallion, and he was coming for them. Legends are not born, they are forged. And John Nicholson was forged in a crucible of such horror, such degradation, that it burned away the softness of youth and left behind a core of cold, tempered steel. To understand the man who stood on the veranda in Peshawar in 1857, staring down a mutiny with the calmness of a statue, we cannot look at his medals or his rank. We must look back 15 years, to the snow-choked passes of Afghanistan and to the dark, freezing dungeon of Ghazni. The year was 1842. The First Anglo-Afghan War often cited as the greatest calamity of the Victorian era, was reaching its catastrophic conclusion. It was a war born of hubris, a great game maneuver designed to install a puppet king in Kabul to buffer against Russian expansion. It ended in the total annihilation of a British army. But before the retreat, before the slaughter, there was the siege. John Nicholson was just 19 years old, a tall, gangly ensign in the 27th Native Infantry. He was stationed at the fortress of Ghazni, a lonely outpost surrounded by hostile tribesmen. When the uprising began in Kabul, the waves of violence crashed against the walls of Ghazni. For weeks, the garrison held out. They fought in the snow, freezing and starving, outnumbered and outgunned. Nicholson, even then, showed flashes of the warrior he would become. He led sorties, he manned the walls, he fought with a desperate courage. But his commanders did not share his spirit. Colonel Palmer, the senior officer, negotiated a surrender. He trusted the word of the Afghan chiefs that the garrison would be given safe passage to India. To the 19-year-old Nicholson, this was not just a mistake, it was a moral failing. When the order came to stack arms, to hand over their swords and muskets to the enemy, Nicholson wept. It is recorded that he thrice drove his sword into the frozen ground, preferring to break the blade rather than surrender it. He threw the hilt at the feet of his captors with a look of such pure, unadulterated hatred that it unnerved even the hardened Afghan warriors. The safe passage was a lie. As soon as the weapons were surrendered, the massacre began. The Sipais were slaughtered or sold into slavery. The British officers and their wives were taken hostage. Nicholson was thrown into a small, filth-ridden dungeon in the citadel of Ghazni. For months he lived in squalor. The room was dark, infested with lice and rats. There was no sanitation. He was taunted, spat upon, and starved. In that darkness the boy died. The cheerful, letter-writing son of an Irish physician vanished. In his place grew something else. He learned the language of his captors, not to communicate, but to understand their threats. He studied their culture not out of curiosity, but to find its pressure points. He stewed in a cocktail of shame and impotent rage. He felt that the British system, the senior officers, the diplomats, the trusting fools, had betrayed him. He resolved, in the silence of that dungeon, that he would never trust again. He would never surrender again. And he would never, ever show mercy to those who broke faith. When relief finally came, when General Pollock's army of retribution forced its way into Afghanistan to rescue the prisoners, Nicholson emerged into the blinding sunlight a skeleton. He was physically wasted, but his eyes had changed. They had acquired that colorless quality, a 1,000-yard stare that looked through people rather than at them. But the horror was not over. On the march back to India, the relieving force moved through the Khyber Pass, the graveyard of Elphinstone's army. The ground was littered with the bleached bones of 16,000 soldiers and camp followers who had been hacked to death during the retreat. It was a landscape of nightmares, and there, amidst the carnage, Nicholson found his brother. Alexander Nicholson had been a promising young officer, serving in a different regiment. John found his body lying by the roadside. The details of the discovery are harrowing. The corpse had been mutilated in the specific, ritualistic manner of the Afghan tribes, a desecration designed to humiliate the enemy even in death. John Nicholson had to identify his brother by the few scraps of uniform clinging to the shattered remains. We can only imagine the sound of his grief in that desolate pass. It was not a loud, wailing grief. It was a silent, suffocating trauma. He sat by the body for a long time. When he finally rose, the transformation was complete. The ghost of Ghazni had been born. He carried the image of his brother's mutilated body with him for the rest of his life. It became the fuel for his engine. It stripped him of the ability to empathize with the enemy. To Nicholson, rebellion was not a political act. It was a personal insult, a crime that demanded blood for blood. When he returned to India, he was a difficult man. He was taciturn, solitary, and prone to dark moods. He had no patience for the frivolities of mess life, the drinking, the gambling, the gossip. He spent his time studying the frontier, learning the dialects, mastering the geography. He was a weapon waiting for a war. Fortunately for the British Empire, there was a man who knew how to use such a weapon. Sir Henry Lawrence, the great administrator of the Punjab, saw past Nicholson's prickly exterior. He saw the brilliance, the integrity, and the raw power. After the Sikh Wars, When the British annexed the Punjab, Lawrence gathered a group of young officers around him to govern the new province. They were known as Henry Lawrence's young men, and they included some of the finest administrators in imperial history. But the most formidable among them was John Nicholson. Lawrence sent Nicholson to the wildest, most lawless district of the frontier, Bannu. Bannu was a hellhole. It was a valley of 400 forts, inhabited by tribes who had never paid tax to any king, Mughal, Sikh or Durrani. Murder was a pastime, blood feuds were the only law. The Sikhs had only been able to collect revenue there by sending an army to burn the harvest every few years. Nicholson was sent there with a small escort and a mandate to bring order to chaos. It was in Bannu that the Nicholson legend truly took shape. He did not govern from a desk. He was always in the saddle, riding 30-40 miles a day. He made himself the hakim, the judge, jury, and executioner. He understood that in a land of violence, the ruler must be the most dangerous man in the valley. Stories of his administration began to circulate, stories that sounded like myths. There is the famous account of the tribal Malik, a chieftain who sat in Nicholson's Durbar court. Nicholson had issued an order that no man was to enter his presence armed, and all must show respect. The Malik, testing the new Saab, spat on the floor between his own feet. It was a subtle, calculated insult. Nicholson did not shout. He did not call for the guards. He simply rose from his chair. The room went silent. He walked over to the Malik and in a blur of motion ordered his own orderlies to seize the man. "Strip him," Nicholson commanded. "Shave his beard, flog him." To shave a Pashtun's beard was to strip him of his manhood, a humiliation worse than death. The Malik was flogged in front of his own peers, then thrown out of the camp. The valley waited for the retaliation. They waited for the tribes to rise up and slaughter this insolent white man, but the retaliation never came. Instead, the tribes submitted. They had recognized a primitive alpha authority. This was not a bureaucrat, this was a warlord. Nicholson dismantled the 400 forts of Bannu not with cannons, but with sheer personality. He told the chiefs that if they did not tear down their own walls, he would do it for them, and he would not stop at the walls. One by one, the towers came down. The valley became peaceful for the first time in centuries. Crime virtually ceased. He dispensed justice under a great banyan tree, hearing cases rapidly, cutting through the lies with a terrifying intuition. A man would be brought before him charged with theft. Nicholson would look at him for a long moment, and the man would confess, trembling. He worked 18 hours a day. He wrote his reports by candlelight, his pistol always on the table. He was incorruptible, efficient, and utterly ruthless. He had no friends, only disciples. The young officers who served under him worshipped him, but they were also terrified of him. He was a man cast in a giant mold, one wrote, with a massive chest and powerful limbs and an expression of grim power. But beneath the administrative genius lay the trauma of 1842. His justice was often draconian. He saw conspiracy everywhere. He believed that the Oriental mind, as he termed it, respected only force. He was creating a peace, yes, but it was the peace of the graveyard. He was keeping the lid on a boiling pot by sitting on it. By the mid-1850s, Nicholson had become the Deputy Commissioner of Peshawar, the most critical station in India. He was the warden of the Kashmir Gate. The trauma of Ghazni had crystallized into a philosophy of active defense. You do not wait for the enemy to attack. You strike him before he even thinks of it. You do not negotiate with mutineers. You annihilate them. So when the telegrams began to arrive in May 1857, when the news of Meerut and Delhi reached the frontier, John Nicholson did not feel the panic that gripped the rest of British India. He felt a dark sense of validation. He had always known this would happen. He had always known that the lazy, trusting system of the company would collapse. He was 34 years old. He was at the height of his physical and mental powers. He had spent 15 years in the wilderness, learning the dark arts of frontier warfare. He had tamed the tribes of Bannu. He had stared down the ghosts of Ghazni. Now, the greatest storm in imperial history was breaking, and he was the only man with the lightning rod. While others debated the loyalty of the Sipe regiments, Nicholson was already sharpening his sword. He knew what had to be done. The logic of the dungeon told him that mercy was weakness. The memory of his brother's body told him that hesitation was death. The forge was closed. The weapon was ready, and God help anyone who stood in its way. In the long, eccentric, and often bizarre history of the British Empire, there is no figure quite like John Nicholson. To find his equal, one has to look back to the myths of antiquity, to the demigods who walked the earth with thunder in their hands. For in the wild frontier of the Punjab, amidst the dust and the heat, something extraordinary happened, something that defies the rational mind of the 20th or 21st century. John Nicholson, a stern, unsmiling Irish Protestant, the son of a Dublin physician, became a god. It was not a metaphor, it was a literal religious fact. A sect of fakirs, Hindu ascetics who had wandered the frontier seeking enlightenment, founded in the terrifying gaze of the deputy commissioner. They called themselves the Nicholsanies. They wore saffron robes and chanted his name as a mantra, Nicholsane, Nicholsane. They believed him to be an avatar of Vishnu or perhaps a reincarnated warrior saint sent to cleanse the land of evil. They followed him from camp to camp, singing hymns in his honor, prostrating themselves in the dust when he rode by. For a man of Nicholson's temperament, a devout, rigid Victorian Christian who read the Bible every morning and believed idolatry to be a mortal sin, this was not a compliment, it was an abomination. His reaction to his own deification provides the most telling insight into his character. When the Nicholsanies were found worshipping at his tent, Nicholson did not reason with them. He did not ask them to stop. He ordered his orderlies to seize them and flog them. He would have them whipped until the blood ran, and here lies the dark absurdity of the frontier. The more he flogged them, the more they worshipped him. To the Nicholsanies, the beating was not punishment, it was a divine chastisement. It was proof of his power. He is a just God, they would say, nursing their wounds. He punishes us because we are unworthy. It is a story that sounds like fiction, a Gothic invention of Kipling, but it is documented fact. It illustrates the sheer, overwhelming force of personality that Nicholson possessed. He did not need to demand respect, he commanded awe. But in May of 1857, the time for myths was over. The time for survival had begun. When the news of the Delhi massacre reached Peshawar, the situation was terrifying. Peshawar was the ultimate outpost, the rim of the wheel. It was garrisoned by 10,000 native troops who were now vibrating with the same mutinous energy that had consumed Meerut. Facing them were fewer than 2,000 British soldiers. If Peshawar fell, the Afghan tribes would pour through the Khyber Pass, joining the mutineers, and a tidal wave of slaughter would roll down the Grand Trunk Road, sweeping the British into the sea. Most commanders would have dug in. They would have retreated to the citadel, pulled up the drawbridge, and prayed for reinforcements. But Nicholson, along with his superior, Herbert Edwards, and the local commander, Sidney Cotton, held a council of war that would change the course of history. They decided that defense was death. To sit and wait was to admit fear, and on the frontier, fear was the smell of blood to a predator. They conceived of a radical, aggressive strategy, the Moveable Column. This was to be a strike force, stripped of all baggage, all luxury, all slow-moving impediments. It would not defend a specific fort. It would roam the Punjab like a pack of wolves, hunting down mutiny wherever it raised its head. It was a gamble of the highest order. It meant leaving the stations vulnerable to concentrate force in a mobile unit. Nicholson was eventually given command of this column, and he transformed it into a weapon of terrifying speed. But before the column could march, the snake in the grass had to be beheaded. The danger lay right there in Peshawar. Through his extensive network of spies, men who feared Nicholson more than they feared the mutineers, he intercepted letters circulating among the native regiments. The correspondence was damning. The sepoys in Peshawar were coordinating a synchronized uprising for the 22nd of May. They planned to seize the magazine, murder the European officers in their beds, and march to Delhi to join the king. The date was the 21st of May. Nicholson went to General Cotton. The older man was brave, but he hesitated. To disarm a regiment, to order soldiers to lay down their weapons was a grave insult. If the order was refused, it would spark the very mutiny they were trying to prevent. It would turn a standoff into a massacre. Nicholson was relentless. His logic was cold and unassailable. The mutiny is inevitable. We choose the time or they do. If we strike now, we have the initiative. If we wait until tomorrow, we are dead men. Cotton relented. The order was given for a sunrise parade on the 22nd. The scene that played out on the parade ground of Peshawar is one of the most cinematic moments of the Victorian age. The sun was just cresting the mountains of Afghanistan, casting long, sharp shadows across the dusty plain. The heat was already rising, shimmering off the hard-baked earth. 4 native regiments, thousands of men were marched onto the square. They were tense, their hands gripping their muskets, their eyes darting back and forth. They knew something was wrong. They could feel the trap closing. Facing them were the British troops, the 70th Queens and the artillery. And here was the grim reality of the Raj stripped of its pageantry. The British infantry were not standing at attention. They were in combat formation. The artillery officers stood by their cannons with lit portfires, the slow matches glowing red in the morning light. The guns were not loaded with blanks. They were loaded with canister, tins filled with musket balls that would turn the parade ground into a slaughterhouse in seconds. Nicholson rode between the lines. He was the fulcrum upon which the fate of India balanced. If a single musket had been fired, if a single command had been shouted in defiance, the cannons would have opened up. The command rang out, "Pile arms." There was a silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to last for an hour. The sepoys looked at their officers. They looked at the British infantry with their leveled rifles. They looked at the smoking matches of the artillery. And then they looked at Nicholson. They saw the man the fakirs worshipped. They saw the ghost of Ghazni, and their nerve broke. A clatter began, a chaotic metallic sound that grew into a roar as thousands of muskets were stacked into pyramids. Cavalrymen unbuckled their sabers and threw them onto the heaps. They stripped off their belts and pouches. Within 30 minutes, 4 regiments, the flower of the Bengal army, stood disarmed, humiliated, and impotent. The psychological impact was instantaneous. The tribal chiefs of the Khyber, who had been watching from the surrounding hills like vultures waiting to see which carcass to pick, saw the Sabs assert their dominance without firing a shot. They saw the weapons piled high. In that moment, the balance of power shifted. The chiefs came down from the hills, not to kill the British, but to enlist. "You have proved you are the masters," one chief told Nicholson. "We will fight for you." But the work was not done. Mere disarmament was not enough for Nicholson. He needed to send a message that would freeze the blood of any potential traitor in the Punjab. A few days later, the 55th Native Infantry, stationed at a nearby outpost, mutinied. They killed their officers and fled into the hills, hoping to escape into Kashmir. Nicholson didn't just send troops, he led the pursuit himself. He was in the saddle for 20 hours a day, hunting them through ravines and across rock faces. He ran them to ground. Hundreds were killed in the fighting, but he brought back prisoners. He brought them back to Peshawar for a spectacle of archaic brutality, blowing from guns. This was a punishment reserved for mutiny, a method of execution designed to be so horrific that it would deter any observer. The prisoner was tied with his back to the muzzle of a cannon. When the gun was fired, the man was not just killed, he was disintegrated. It was a shocking, visceral annihilation. On the execution day, thousands of locals and soldiers were assembled. The air was thick with dread. Nicholson sat on his horse, watching. He was urged by some officers to show mercy, to execute only a few as an example. Nicholson refused. He believed that mercy was a luxury they could not afford. To him, these men had broken their oath. They had murdered women and children. They had forfeited their right to exist. As the smoke cleared from the cannons, drifting across the silence of the cantonment, the message was understood. There was no middle ground. There was no negotiation. There was only the Sarkar, the government, and its terrible justice. It is difficult for the modern mind to reconcile the image of John Nicholson, the man who read scripture and wrote tender letters to his mother, with the man who presided over such carnage. But Nicholson did not see himself as a butcher. He saw himself as a dam holding back a flood. He wrote to a friend during this period, "I have the law of the land to support me, and if I have to hang every mutineer in the Punjab, I will do it to save the rest." By June, the Punjab was quiet. It was the silence of the tomb, perhaps, but it was quiet. Nicholson had achieved the impossible. He had secured the rear. He had disarmed the enemy within the gates and terrified the enemy without. He had turned the movable column into a finely honed blade. Now he turned his eyes south. The telegrams from Delhi were getting more desperate. The tiny British force on the ridge was dying of cholera and heatstroke. They were outnumbered 4-1, clinging to the rocks like shipwrecked sailors. They were calling for help. They were calling for the one man who could break the deadlock. Nicholson gathered his officers. The administrative work was done. The political officer was being left behind. The general was taking the field. He gave the order to march. The movable column, a serpentine line of dust and bayonets, turned onto the Grand Trunk Road. They were marching into the furnace of the Indian summer towards the greatest fortress in India. As he rode out of Peshawar, leaving the safety of the province he had pacified, Nicholson knew he was riding towards his destiny. The fakirs who still trailed in his wake, whispering his name, knew it too. The Avatar was going to war, and Delhi was waiting. It was a march into the mouth of a furnace. The movable column, the weapon forged in the cool, high valleys of Peshawar, was now descending into the flat, baking plains of the Punjab summer. To understand the physical toll of this movement, one must appreciate the meteorological violence of India in July and August. The loo wind had ceased, replaced by the suffocating, humid blanket of the monsoon. The air was not just hot, it was heavy, pressing down on the lungs like a physical weight. The temperature hovered near 120 degrees. Men did not just faint, they dropped dead in the ranks, their blood boiling in their veins from heat stroke or apoplexy, as the surgeons called it. Yet the column moved. It moved because at its head rode a figure who seemed impervious to the elements. John Nicholson rode in the dust and the glare, his face a mask of grim determination. He slept little, ate less, and drove his men with a relentless, terrifying energy. He knew that speed was the only currency that mattered. Every hour wasted on the road was an hour the mutineers in Delhi had to strengthen their defenses. Every delay brought the spectre of a general Sikh uprising closer to reality. The column covered the miles, Amritsar, Jalandhar, Ludhiana, leaving a trail of exhausted men and dead horses. But as they marched, the legend of the Nicholson grew. The sheer audacity of the movement, the sight of this massive force barreling down the Grand Trunk Road, had a paralyzing effect on the countryside. Villages that might have risen in revolt stayed quiet. Local chieftains who were wavering sent supplies instead of swords. The mere presence of Nicholson was worth a brigade of infantry. On the 14th of August, the column finally marched into the British camp at Delhi. The sight that greeted them was sobering. The siege of Delhi was, at this stage, a misnomer. The British were not besieging the city, they were barely holding onto a rocky spine of ground known as the Ridge, overlooking the northern walls. They were the besieged. For months, 30,000 rebel sepoys, supported by the heavy artillery of the Delhi arsenal, had hammered the British position. The camp was a landscape of misery. It was riddled with cholera, dysentery, and flies. The stench of unburied carcasses and open latrines hung over the tents. The commanding officer, General Archdale Wilson, was a man on the verge of a nervous breakdown, fretful, hesitant, and constantly talking of retreat. Into this atmosphere of defeatism strode John Nicholson. His arrival was electric. A young officer noted in his diary, "Nicholson has come. The camp is all alive. His very presence puts heart into the men." He did not look like the other generals, with their red faces and gold braid. He walked through the lines in civilian clothes, a dark suit and a pith helmet, looking more like a brooding giant than a soldier. He inspected the pickets, stared at the walls of Delhi with his colorless eyes, and immediately began to criticize the lethargy of the command. He had not marched 300 miles to sit on a ridge and die of disease. He had come to take the city. But before the assault could even be planned, a crisis emerged that threatened to end the campaign before it began. The British were waiting for the siege train, a massive convoy of heavy siege guns, ammunition, and engineering supplies crawling its way down from Ferozpur. Without these guns, the thick red sandstone walls of Delhi could never be breached. The spies inside the city, however, had alerted the rebel commanders. They knew the train was coming. They knew it was the juggernaut that would destroy them. The rebels dispatched a powerful force, the elite Nemuch Brigade, to intercept the convoy. Their plan was sound: swing around the British rear, cut the road, capture the guns, and starve the ridge into submission. If they succeeded, the British army would be cut off in hostile territory without supplies or hope. It would be the end of the Raj. General Wilson, characteristically, dithered. He was afraid to weaken his force on the ridge to meet the threat. but Nicholson demanded the right to intercept. He bullied Wilson into giving him a column, about 2,000 men and 16 guns, to chase down the rebels. On the morning of August 25th, Nicholson marched out. If the march to Delhi had been a furnace, the march to Najafgarh was a swamp. The monsoon had finally broken in torrents of vertical rain. The roads had dissolved into rivers of mud. The terrain was a nightmare of waterlogged fields and marshes. The artillery horses floundered to their bellies in the mire. The men waded through water up to their knees. It was a logistical horror story. By all conventional military wisdom, an attack was impossible. The ground was too soft for cavalry, too slow for infantry, and impossible for artillery. But Nicholson did not deal in the conventional. He pushed the column forward, dragging the cannons through the sludge by hand when the horses failed. By late afternoon, they reached the village of Najafgarh. The scene that presented itself would have daunted a lesser commander. The rebels had chosen their ground well. They were positioned across a deep, flooded canal. Their center was anchored on a caravanserai, a fortified, walled-in that bristled with cannon. To their left lay a swamp. To their right, a village filled with sharpshooters. They numbered around 6,000 disciplined, uniformed Sipahs, the same men who had been trained by British officers to fight in line and square. They had the high ground, the numbers, and the defensive advantage. The British troops were exhausted. They had marched 18 miles through mud and rain. They were hungry and soaked to the skin. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, gloomy shadows across the flooded plain. Most generals would have halted, camped, and waited for morning. Nicholson knew that morning would be too late. The rebels would strengthen their position or slip away to attack the siege train. He rode to the front of the line. The plan he formed was simple, brutal, and classic. He would not engage in a long-range artillery duel. He would not try to outmaneuver them in the swamp. He would smash through their center. He turned to the 61st Regiment of Foot, tough, hard-bitten British infantrymen. He gave a speech that was short, devoid of rhetoric, and terrifyingly practical. "Men of the 61st," he shouted over the sound of the rain and the distant enemy guns. "I have no speech to make to you. You know what to do. Hold your fire until you are within 20 yards, then pour it into them and charge with the bayonet." It was a tactic from the Napoleonic Wars, or perhaps even earlier. It relied entirely on nerve. The order was given, "Advance." The line of British infantry stepped off into the mud. The rebel artillery opened fire immediately. Grape-shot canvas bags filled with iron balls tore through the air. Men fell splashing into the bloody water. The rebel infantry unleashed a rolling volley of musketry. The air buzzed with lead, but the 61st did not fire back. They had their orders. They marched in a grim, disciplined silence, closing the gap step by agonizing step. This silent advance is one of the most unnerving spectacles in warfare. To the rebels watching from the Sarai, it must have been terrifying. They fired and fired, but the line of redcoats kept coming, stepping over their dead, relentless, silent, unstoppable. Nicholson rode at the head of the line, a giant target on a horse, seemingly immune to the storm of metal flying around him. When they were within the prescribed distance, so close they could see the faces of the mutineers, Nicholson dropped his sword. The 61st stopped. They raised their Enfield rifles. The volley that followed was a single, cracking thunderclap that tore the heart out of the rebel line. Before the smoke could clear, the roar went up, a guttural British cheer, and the bayonets came down. The charge hit the Sarai like a physical hammer blow. The Sipahs, for all their training, could not withstand the ferocity of the assault. They broke. The British poured over the walls of the Sarai, bayoneting the gunners at their posts. The fighting was vicious, hand-to-hand, a chaotic swirl of sword, butt-stroke, and steel. Nicholson did not pause. He wheeled the line to the right, rolling up the enemy flank, sweeping down the length of the rebel position. The retreat turned into a rout. The rebels fled across the bridge over the canal, clogging the narrow crossing. Nicholson brought up his horse artillery, unlimbering the guns in the mud, and poured canister shot into the retreating mass. It was a massacre. By the time the sun finally set, the Najafgarh Brigade had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The British had captured 13 guns and inflicted hundreds of casualties. The road for the siege train was open. But the battle revealed something more than just tactical superiority. It revealed the nature of the man leading them. During the height of the fighting, an officer approached Nicholson to report that the troops were exhausted and needed rest. Nicholson looked at him with cold fury. "Rest," he snapped. "We are here to kill, not to rest." He drove them on until the last enemy gun was spiked and the last rebel had fled into the darkness. The victory at Najafgarh was the turning point of the entire campaign. Until that moment, the British had been on the defensive, paralyzed by the numbers and the position of the enemy. Nicholson had proven that the rebels could be beaten in the open field, even when the odds were stacked against the British. He had shattered the morale of the Delhi garrison. When the survivors of the Nimach brigade straggled back into the city, they brought with them tales of a demon, a giant who marched through swamps and charged into cannon fire without blinking. The siege train arrived safely at the ridge a week later. The great iron monsters, the 24-pounder siege guns, and the massive mortars were dragged into camp by elephants. The means to take the city were now at hand. But the victory had come at a cost. The British troops were worn to the bone, and within the high command, the tension was reaching a breaking point. General Wilson, terrified by the risks Nicholson was taking, became even more cautious. He looked at the walls of Delhi, miles of fortified stone, defended by 30,000 desperate men, and he quailed. He wanted to wait. He wanted more reinforcements. He wanted a guarantee of success. Nicholson, fresh from the slaughter of Najafgarh, would have none of it. He walked into the headquarters tent, muddy and smelling of gunpowder, and laid his pistol on the table. The time for the political officer was long gone. The time for the general was passing. Now it was time for the avenger. He looked at the map of Delhi, at the jagged line of the Kashmir Gate and the water bastion. He knew that taking the city would not be a battle, it would be a meat grinder. It would require a sacrifice of blood that would stain the history of the empire forever. And he knew, with that same dark, prophetic instinct that had guided him since Ghazni, that he would be the one to pay the price. The guns were here, the stage was set, the ridge of death was waiting. The ridge was not a fortress, it was a graveyard. By early September 1857, the British camp outside Delhi had become a place of medieval squalor, a purgatory where men waited to die. It was a rocky spine of ground, barely 60 feet high, baking under a merciless sun that turned the tents into ovens. But the heat was the least of their worries. Camp was rotting. Thousands of men, horses, camels, and elephants were crammed into a confined space that had been occupied for 3 months. The ground was saturated with filth. The air was thick with a stench so physical it could be tasted, a miasma of open latrines, putrefying animal carcasses, and the sweet, sickly smell of gangrene. Cholera stalked the lines like a silent assassin. It took strong men in the morning and left them as shriveled corpses by sunset. The hospitals were overflowing. There were no anesthetics, no antibiotics, and very little hope. To the soldiers shivering in the fever wards or sweating on the picket lines, Delhi looked less like a prize and more like a tomb. Through the haze, they could see the red fort shimmering in the distance, the heart of the rebellion, the city of the Mughals. Its walls were formidable, massive ramparts of red sandstone, 12 feet thick and 30 feet high, ringed by a deep, wet ditch. Behind those walls waited 30,000 Sipahis, well-fed, well-armed, and fighting with the desperation of men who knew a hangman's noose awaited them if they failed. The British force, by contrast, was a skeleton crew. They had barely 6,000 men fit for duty. By all the rules of warfare, they should have been the ones surrendering. They were outnumbered 5-1. They were sick, exhausted, and demoralized, and they were led by a man who had lost his nerve. General Archdale Wilson was a tragedy of command. He was a competent artillery officer in peacetime, but the pressure of the mutiny had broken him. He was old, frail, and terrified of failure. He spent his days writing anxious letters to his wife and his nights pacing his tent, consumed by the fear that he would be the general who lost India. He looked at the walls of Delhi and saw only impregnability. He looked at his dwindling roster and saw only disaster. He began to talk, openly and dangerously, of raising the siege. He spoke of retreating to the Punjab, of abandoning the ridge. In a military camp, defeatism is more contagious than cholera. If the general wavered, the army wavered. The whisper of retreat began to circulate through the mess tents. But there was one man on the ridge who did not know the meaning of the word. John Nicholson walked through the camp like a storm cloud. He held no official command over the army. He was technically just a brigadier commanding a column, but his moral authority was absolute. He saw Wilson's hesitation not as caution, but as criminal negligence. To Nicholson, retreat was impossible. It would signal to every wavering prince and potentate in India that the British were finished. The Punjab would rise. The Sikhs would turn. The empire would end in a bloodbath. The tension between the two men was electric. Wilson, the trembling bureaucrat, Nicholson, the frontier warlord. It is recorded that during a heated staff meeting, when Wilson once again suggested pulling back, Nicholson was heard to mutter to a fellow officer, "Thank God I am not the commander-in-chief, for if I were, I would have shot him." It was not a figure of speech. Nicholson was entirely capable of executing his own superior officer to save the campaign. The deadlock was broken on the 4th of September. The horizon to the north darkened with dust. The earth began to tremble. The siege train had arrived. It was a majestic and terrifying sight. Drawn by lines of trumpeting elephants and teams of straining oxen, the great guns of the empire rolled into camp. There were massive 24-pounder siege cannons, 8-inch howitzers, and heavy mortars. Along with them came hundreds of carts filled with powder and shot. The tools for the job were finally here. But tools are useless without the will to use them. Wilson looked at the guns and wrung his hands. He argued that they still didn't have enough men to storm the breach even if they made one. He wanted to wait for reinforcements from the south. He wanted to wait for the weather to cool. Nicholson had had enough. He went to the chief engineer, Richard Bayard Smith, a man who was himself dying of gangrene and scurvy, yet refusing to leave his post, and together they cornered Wilson. The scene played out in Wilson's tent, a stifling, claustrophobic confrontation. Nicholson laid it out with brutal clarity. The army was dying on the ridge. Every day they waited, they lost more men to disease than they would in an assault. The enemy was strengthening their defenses. There were no more reinforcements coming. It was now or never. Wilson, bullied, badgered, and essentially terrified of his own subordinate, finally capitulated. He gave a reluctant nod. "You may try," he said, washing his hands of the responsibility, "but I fear it will be a disaster." Nicholson didn't wait for him to change his mind. He effectively hijacked the command of the army. The plan was drawn up immediately. It was a plan of breathtaking audacity, designed by the young genius of the engineers, Alexander Taylor. They would not try to surround the city. They didn't have the men. They would not try to starve it out. They didn't have the time. They would smash a hole in the wall and go in with the bayonet. They targeted the northern face of the city, the stretch of wall between the water bastion and the Kashmir Gate. But to breach the wall, they had to build battery positions for the heavy guns, and they had to build them right under the noses of the enemy within point-blank musket range. The nights of early September became a fever dream of labor. Under the cover of darkness, hundreds of men, British sappers, Sikh pioneers, and local labourers crept down from the ridge into the tangle of jungle and ruins near the walls. They worked in silence, filling sandbags, digging trenches, dragging the multi-ton guns into position. The enemy could hear them. The sepoys on the walls fired blindly into the dark. Rockets flared overhead, illuminating the sweating, digging men. The Great Breaching began on the morning of September 8th. When the first battery opened fire, the ground shook. The British had concentrated their firepower on specific sections of the curtain wall. The noise was apocalyptic. For days and nights, the guns did not stop. The air was filled with a continuous, rolling thunder. The smoke was so thick that the gunners couldn't see the walls. They fired by mathematical calculation, aiming at coordinates. Inside the batteries, it was hell. The sun beat down on the men, and the enemy returned fire with everything they had. The rebels were not cowards. They stood to their guns, pouring shot and shell into the British positions. Men were blown to pieces as they sponged the cannons. Officers jumped onto the parapets to spot the fall of shot, only to be picked off by snipers. But the fire never slackened. Nicholson spent these days in the batteries, exposing himself to fire with a recklessness that bordered on the suicidal. He sat on the sandbags, watching the masonry of the Kashmir bastion crumble under the relentless pounding. He was checking the breach, counting the stones as they fell. He was not looking for a practicable breach, a slope a horse could ride up. He was looking for a hole big enough for men to scramble through. By the evening of September 13th, the engineers reported that the work was done. The walls were shattered. Great avalanches of rubble had slid down into the ditch, forming rough ramps. The enemy guns on the bastions had been silenced. The moment had arrived. That night the camp was strangely quiet. The great bombardment had ceased. The silence was heavier than the noise. In the tents, men wrote their final letters home. They sharpened their bayonets. They made their peace with God. Everyone knew that the next day would decide the fate of the nation. Nicholson summoned the column commanders to his tent for the final briefing. The plan was complex and dangerous. The army was to be divided into 4 assault columns. The first column, led by Nicholson himself, would storm the breach near the Kashmir bastion and scale the face of the bastion itself. The second column would attack the water bastion breach. The third column would blow open the Kashmir Gate with gunpowder and rush through the tunnel. The fourth column would attack the suburb of Kishkinganj to create a diversion. It was a desperate roll of the dice. If one column failed, the others would be flanked and destroyed. If the assault was repulsed, there was no reserve. The army would be broken, and the women and children in the camp would be at the mercy of the mutineers. Nicholson looked at his officers. Many of them were barely out of their 20s. Some were old friends, others were strangers. He spoke with a quiet, intense gravity. He told them that no quarter was to be given. They were to press forward at all costs. "Don't fire," he told them. "The bayonet is the only weapon for tomorrow." He specifically ordered that no man was to stop to help a wounded comrade. "If I fall," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "you must leave me. The column must not stop." As the officers filed out into the darkness, Nicholson remained alone. We cannot know exactly what he thought in those final hours. Did he think of his mother in Ireland? Did he think of his brother's mutilated body in the Khyber Pass? Or did he think of the prophecy of the fakirs that he was a god destined for a violent end? He checked his revolver. He loosened his sword in its scabbard. He was not dressed in the scarlet uniform of a general. He wore his plain dark coat and his pith helmet. He wanted to be recognized by his men, but he had no need for gold braid to assert his authority. At 3:00 a.m., the camp began to stir. There were no bugles, no drums. Men woke in the dark, drank cold tea and fell in. The 60th Rifles moved out first to cover the advance as skirmishers. Then came the great columns of infantry, the 52nd Light Infantry, the Bengal Fusiliers, the Sikhs, the Gurkhas. A cocktail of races and religions, united by discipline and the will of one man. They marched down from the ridge in the pre-dawn gloom, moving into the cover of the orange groves and the ruined custom house near the walls. The air was cool, a deceptive respite before the heat of the day. As they crouched in the trenches, waiting for the sun, Nicholson walked down the line of the first column. He towered over the men. He didn't offer words of comfort. He looked at them with those pale, lion-like eyes, and they looked back with a mixture of fear and devotion. They knew he would be the first man up the ladder. They knew he would not ask them to do anything he would not do himself. The sky in the east began to turn grey, then pink. The silhouette of the battered walls of Delhi emerged from the darkness. The enemy was waiting. The ramparts were lined with thousands of muskets. The portfires of the rebel cannons were glowing. Nicholson looked at his watch. It was daylight. The element of surprise was gone. He stepped out of the trench, drew his sword and pointed it at the breach. The waiting was over. The ridge of death had done its work. Now the lion was coming for the city. The sun rose on the morning of September 14th, 1857, not to the sound of birdsong, but to the roar of the apocalypse. At the specific, prearranged signal, the sudden, sharp crack of rifles from the skirmishers of the 60th, the British assault columns rose from the earth. For weeks they had been moles, digging in the dirt, hiding in trenches. Now they were lions. A shout went up, a raw, guttural release of months of pent-up rage and fear, and the scarlet lines surged forward across the open ground. They were running into a wall of fire. The rebel sepoys on the ramparts of Delhi had seen them coming. The whole northern face of the city erupted. Musketry crackled like dry wood in a bonfire, and the cannons, loaded with grape and canister, vomited iron into the packed ranks of the attackers. To the left, the first column, led by John Nicholson, raced for the breach at the Kashmir bastion. To the right, the second column sprinted for the water bastion. In the center, a small, desperate drama was playing out that would become one of the most hallowed legends of the British Army. This was the blowing of the Kashmir Gate. The gate was still standing, a massive portal of wood and iron, barred and bolted against the world. It had to be destroyed to allow the third column to enter. A small party of engineers and sappers, led by Lieutenants Home and Salk, volunteered for what was essentially a suicide mission. They ran across the open ground, carrying bags of gunpowder directly into the teeth of the enemy fire. The bridge over the ditch had been destroyed, leaving only a single, precariously narrow beam. One by one, under a hail of bullets that churned the dust around their feet, they crossed the beam, laid the powder bags against the gate, and lit the fuse. Lieutenant Salk was shot through the arm and leg. The sergeant who took the match from him was killed instantly. Another sergeant snatched the match and lit the train. The explosion was deafening. A massive cloud of dust and splintered timber shot into the sky. The gate was shattered. Amidst the smoke and the falling debris, a bugler, Robert Hawthorne, stood up and sounded the advance. He sounded it again and again, the brass notes cutting through the din of battle, calling the waiting infantry into the inferno. The third column heard the call. They rose and charged, pouring through the smoking ruin of the gate, bayonets fixed, screaming as they entered the city. Meanwhile, at the Kashmir bastion, Nicholson was leading from the front. The breach here was not a neat hole. It was a chaotic slope of loose rubble, steep and treacherous. The ladder parties ran forward, but as they reached the ditch, they were mown down. The ladders fell with them. Men scrambled over the bodies of their comrades, picking up the heavy wooden ladders, sliding down into the ditch, and rearing them up against the escarpment. It was a scene of medieval savagery. The rebels were leaning over the parapets, firing point blank, hurling stones and grenades, but the impetus of the assault was unstoppable. The British and Indian troops of the columns swarmed up the ladders like ants. They clawed their way up the rubble slope, slipping and sliding, pulling themselves up by the roots of bushes and the hands of the men above them. Nicholson was one of the first over the wall. He stood on the ramparts, a towering figure in the smoke, waving his sword to rally the stragglers. The British ensign was planted on the bastion, snapping in the wind. A cheer went up that could be heard miles away in the camp. The outer crust of the defense was broken. The British were inside Delhi. But as every soldier knows, breaking into a fortified city is only the beginning of the nightmare. The fighting on the walls was one thing, the fighting in the streets was another. As the columns converged inside the Kashmir Gate, the cohesion of the army began to disintegrate. The city was a labyrinth of narrow, twisting lanes, flat-roofed houses, and hidden courtyards. Every window was a loophole, every rooftop was a sniper's nest. The rebels, realizing the walls were lost, fell back into the city, turning every street into a kill zone. Confusion reigned. Officers lost their men lost their regiments. The heat was becoming unbearable. The adrenaline of the charge was fading, replaced by a desperate, parched thirst. And then a new enemy appeared, alcohol. The British troops, stumbling through the bazaars, found vast stores of liquor, brandy, rum, arrack left behind by the merchants. In the chaos and the horror of the street fighting, discipline cracked. Men began to drink. Within hours, parts of the attacking force were dissolving into a drunken mob. It was a critical moment. If the rebels had launched a coordinated counterattack then, they could have driven the British back out of the city. But Nicholson was not drunk, and he was not stopping. He had taken the main guard. He had secured the northern perimeter, but his orders were to push west, to sweep along the ramparts and capture the Lahore Gate. This was the key to the city. If he could take the Lahore Gate, the backbone of the defense would be snapped. He gathered what men he could, a mixed force of the 1st Bengal Fusiliers, the 75th Foot, and some Sikhs, and began to push through the narrow lanes towards the Burn Bastion, which guarded the approach to the Lahore Gate. This was the deadliest part of the battle. The lane they had to traverse was barely 10 feet wide. On one side was the city wall, on the other, a row of flat-roofed houses occupied by rebel sharpshooters. At the far end of the lane, the rebels had positioned a brass field gun loaded with grape. Behind it, a second gun, and behind that, a wall of musketry. The British troops advanced into the lane, and the world exploded. The grape shot tore through the narrow space, ricocheting off the stone walls, turning the lane into a slaughterhouse. The leading men were cut to pieces. The survivors recoiled, pressing themselves into the doorways and alcoves, seeking any cover from the storm of lead. Nicholson was at the rear, organizing the reserve. When he saw the advance stall, a cold fury took hold of him. He knew that momentum was everything. If they stopped now, if they let the rebels regroup, the assault would fail. They would be trapped inside the city, cut off and destroyed. He pushed his way to the front. The scene was chaotic. The officers were trying to rally the men, but the soldiers were shaken. They had seen their comrades turned into red mist by the cannon fire. They were exhausted, thirsty, and terrified. They refused to move. Nicholson stepped out into the center of the lane. He was the only man standing upright. He turned his back to the enemy gun, facing his own men. He was a giant in a land of mortals, his sword drawn, his face twisted in a snarl of contempt and command. He shouted at them, his voice booming over the roar of the battle. He called them cowards. He grabbed the nearest color sergeant and dragged him forward. He pointed his sword at the enemy gun, demanding, ordering, willing them to charge. "Come on, men," he roared. "Don't let me see a British soldier quail." For a moment, it seemed to work. The sheer force of his will, the terrifying spectacle of his bravery, shamed them. The men began to step out from the cover. They tightened their grip on their rifles. They prepared to follow him into the fire one last time. But the enemy was watching too. On a rooftop overlooking the lane, a rebel Seep, his name lost to history, but his aim true, saw the giant officer. He saw the way the other Saabs deferred to him. He saw the gold braid, or perhaps just the undeniable aura of command. He raised his musket. The distance was short. He couldn't miss. The shot was not a thunderclap. It was a sharp, singular crack that sounded different from the volley fire. The ball struck Nicholson in the side, just below the ribs. It smashed through his lung and lodged in his spine. The giant stopped. The sword dropped from his hand. He did not fall immediately. He staggered, grasping at the air, a look of profound shock crossing his face. Then slowly, like a great oak tree finally succumbing to the axe, he crumpled to the ground. A gasp went through the ranks. It was a sound of collective horror. To the men of the Moveable Column, Nicholson was not just a general, he was invincible. He was the Nicholsane, the god of war. To see him down, bleeding in the dust of a dirty alleyway, shattered their reality. A young officer, Captain Barter, rushed forward and caught him. Nicholson was in agony, his face grey, the blood pooling dark on his coat. But even then the iron will did not break. When a sergeant tried to lift him, Nicholson growled, "I will not be carried, I will walk." But he could not walk. The lower half of his body was paralyzed. The bullet had done its work. They laid him on a dually, a simple stretcher. The attack on the Lahore Gate collapsed instantly. Without his voice to drive them, the spirit went out of the Fusiliers. They fell back, retreating from the lane of death, leaving the guns in enemy hands. The news of his fall spread through the army like a contagion. Nicholson is down. The general is dying. It passed from company to company, from regiment to regiment. A gloom settled over the British forces. They had taken the walls, yes. They held the Kashmir Gate, but they felt as though they had lost the battle. Lord Roberts, who would later become a field marshal and a legend in his own right, was a young staff officer that day. He found Nicholson's stretcher abandoned by the side of the road near the Kashmir Gate. The native bearers, terrified by the fighting, had dumped him and fled. Nicholson was lying alone, exposed to the sun and the stray bullets, gasping for air. Roberts dismounted and knelt beside him. He gave the dying man a sip of water mixed with brandy. Nicholson looked at him, his eyes glazing over with pain, and asked, "How is the battle going?" Roberts tried to be optimistic, but Nicholson saw through it. He knew the attack had stalled. He knew the army was fragile. He grabbed Roberts' arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "I am dying," he whispered, "but tell Wilson, Tell him he must hold the city. If he retreats now, I will shoot him in my bed." It was the quintessential Nicholson moment. Even as his lifeblood leaked out onto the stones of Delhi, he was still issuing orders, still threatening executions, still fighting the war. He was carried back to the camp on the ridge, the same camp he had left that morning as the Avenger. The journey was a torture. Every jolt of the stretcher sent spasms of agony through his shattered frame. When he arrived at the field hospital, the surgeons shook their heads. There was nothing they could do. The wound was mortal. Back in the city, the sun set on a scene of carnage and confusion. The British held only a sliver of Delhi, the northern rim. The rest of the city, the vast, dark expanse of the Mughal capital, was still in rebel hands. The fighting would go on for another week, brutal house-to-house clearing operations, but the soul of the assault had been removed. The lion had fallen. For the next 9 days, while the army fought on, John Nicholson lay in his tent, fighting his own private battle with death. He refused to die until the city was taken. He lay there, listening to the distant roar of the guns, demanding hourly reports. When he heard that General Wilson was again contemplating a retreat because of the heavy casualties, Nicholson's rage flared one last time. He dictated a message, his voice a rasping whisper, "Thank God I have strength yet to shoot him, if necessary." It was his will that kept the flag flying. The spirit of the army remained tethered to that dying man in the tent. They fought not for Wilson, not for the East India Company, and perhaps not even for Queen Victoria. They fought because they could not bear to let Nicholson down. On September 20th, the Red Fort finally fell. The King of Delhi, the last Mughal emperor, was captured. The rebellion in the city was crushed. Only then, when the news was brought to his bedside that the Union Jack flew over the palace of the Mughals, did John Nicholson allow himself to let go. The tension left his body. The colorless eyes, which had terrified a continent, finally closed. He died on the 23rd of September, aged just 34. He had lived like a character from a Homeric epic, and he had died like one. He left behind a legacy that would be debated for a century, a legacy of brilliance, brutality, salvation, and horror. But on that night, as the smoke drifted over the conquered city of Delhi, there was only silence. The god was dead, and the empire he had saved would never be the same again. John Nicholson was buried on the morning of the 24th of September, 1857. The location was a small, dusty cemetery just outside the Kashmir Gate, the very portal he had forced open with his will. It was not a grand state funeral. There were no gun carriages drawn by black horses, no muffled drums echoing through the streets of London. It was a soldier's burial in a city that still smelled of smoke and death. The attendees were a strange and telling collection of men. There were the British officers, of course, men like Roberts and Wilson, their uniforms stained and tattered. But standing alongside them, weeping openly, were the bearded warriors of the frontier, the Pathan and Sikh chieftains who had followed him from the mountains. These were men who did not weep for their own fathers, yet they tore their beards and threw dust on their heads for the Nicholson. They understood, perhaps better than the British, what had been lost. They knew that a force of nature had passed from the earth. With the first shovel of earth that fell onto his coffin, an era ended. To assess the legacy of John Nicholson is to wrestle with the central paradox of the British Empire. He is the ultimate Rorschach test of imperial history. To the Victorians, he was a saint, the hero of Delhi, the man who saved India. To the modern eye, he appears as a monster, a racist, a tyrant, a man who advocated flaying alive and burning. Both views are true, and neither is sufficient. Let us first consider the cold, hard strategic reality. Without John Nicholson, Delhi would not have fallen in September 1857. General Wilson would have retreated. The siege would have been raised. The moment the British turned their backs on the Mughal capital, the Punjab would have exploded. The Sikh regiments, who were watching the scales of war with pragmatic eyes, would have turned on their masters. The Afghan tribes would have poured through the Khyber. The British presence in India, comprising a few thousand men, would have been swept away like leaves in a monsoon. There would have been no Raj as we know it, no 90 years of imperial rule, no railways, no unification of the subcontinent under a single administration. The history of South Asia, and indeed the world, would have been rewritten. Nicholson did not just win a battle, he secured a subcontinent. He bought the empire another century of life with his own blood. But the cost of that purchase was terrifying. Nicholson represented the Old Testament style of leadership. He belonged to an age of warrior kings, not civil servants. He was a man who believed in the efficacy of terror. His letters from the period are chilling to read. He urged the passing of a bill to authorize flaying alive, impalement, or burning for the mutineers of the regiments that had killed women and children. He wrote, "The idea of simply hanging the perpetrators of such atrocities is maddening." He was a man devoid of the capacity for compromise. In the peace that followed the mutiny, a peace that he made possible, there was no place for him. The administration that took over India in 1858, when the Crown replaced the East India Company, was a bureaucracy. It was a government of files, committees, and laws. Nicholson would have been court-martialed in such a world. He was a creature of the crisis, a sword that needed to be sheathed in the earth because it was too sharp to be worn at the hip. Fate, in its grim mercy, removed him at the precise moment his utility was exhausted. The strangest chapter of his legacy concerns the Nicholsonis, the cult that worshipped him. Their fate is a tragic footnote that speaks to the hypnotic power of his personality. When the news of his death reached the frontier, the reaction among his devotees was extreme. One of their leaders, an old fakir, declared that there was no point in living if the god was dead. He dug his own grave and cut his throat. Others, however, took a different path. They came to the British missionaries in Peshawar and asked to be baptized. When the astonished priests asked why, the fakirs replied that they wished to worship the God that Nicholson had worshipped. If the Nicholson knelt before Jesus Christ, then Christ must be the supreme deity. It is a bizarre, almost uncomfortable theological twist. A man who ruled by the whip and the sword became, inadvertently, an evangelist. As the 19th century wore on, the legend of Nicholson grew, even as the details of his brutality were quietly airbrushed. A magnificent statue was erected in Delhi, depicting him sword in hand, facing the Kashmir Gate. For generations of British officers serving in India, he was the gold standard, the patron saint of the frontier. They studied his campaigns, they quoted his maxims. He was the archetype of the man on the spot, the officer who ignores orders from headquarters to do what is necessary. But as the empire retreated, so did Nicholson. When India gained independence in 1947, the statues of the viceroys and generals were taken down. Nicholson's statue was removed from Delhi, shipped back to Ireland, and re-erected in the town of Lisburn, where it stands to this day. He stands there still, looking out over school playground, a Victorian Titan exiled to a quiet corner of County Antrim. Today he is largely forgotten by the British public. The history books have moved on. We prefer heroes who are unambiguous, whose morality aligns with our own. Nicholson is too jagged, too dark. He sits uncomfortably in the modern narrative. We acknowledge the horror of the mutiny, but we recoil from the horror of the suppression. We look at the blowing from guns and the summary executions, and we judge him. And yet, if we strip away the judgment of hindsight, we are left with the undeniable fact of his genius. He possessed a quality of leadership that is rare in any age, the ability to make men do the impossible. He took a demoralized, sick, outnumbered army and dragged it by the scruff of the neck to victory. He walked into cannon fire with a nonchalance that made others believe they were immortal. He was 34 years old. In the end, John Nicholson was a tragedy. He was a man whose soul was forged in the dungeon of Ghazni, warped by grief and humiliation, and then sharpened into a weapon of terrible efficiency. He gave everything to the empire, his youth, his humanity, and finally his life. There is a final image that lingers. It is not the image of the general storming the walls, nor the administrator dispensing justice under the banyan tree. It is the image of the grave in Delhi. It is a simple slab of marble. The inscription is brief. It does not list his battles or his titles. It does not call him the Lion of the Punjab. It simply says, "The grave of Brigadier-General John Nicholson, who led the assault of Delhi, but fell in the hour of victory, mortally wounded, and died 23rd September 1857, aged 34. The silence of that grave is the silence of the frontier. It is the silence of the wind blowing down the Khyber Pass. It is the silence of a debt that history acknowledges but can never truly repay. He was the brigadier who fought an entire continent. He was the god who fell. He was the last of the Titans, and we shall not see his like again.